Welcome to Veteran Resource Podcast, where you will meet nonprofit organizations focused on improving the lives of veterans and their family members. Here is your host, Jeremy Paris.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 91 of the Veteran Resource Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Paris. On today's Thought Leader episode, we've got Brian Knowler, who is not a veteran. In fact, he's not even here in America. He is up in Canada, and he is a first responder. This is somebody who went from being a lawyer to being a police officer, so he knows a lot about serving. And like some veterans out there, he also has a lot of experience with PTSD. I got to talking with Brian, and his story is incredible. I hope that you get out of it as much as I got out of it from interviewing him. And you know what? I have a feeling that you're going to. Brian Knowler has been a police officer for 17 years, working in patrol, community response, incident command and emergency management, media relations, and legal services. In 2004, he was the first one on the scene of a fatal collision in which the driver who died was a close friend of Brian's. Brian buried the impact of that night until 2012, when he hit bottom physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, and was finally diagnosed with PTSD from his experience. He now speaks and writes extensively on topics around psychological health and trauma in the emergency response field and has been consulted by media outlets across Canada. In March 2016, he published On the Other Side of Broken, One Cop's Battle with the Demons of PTSD. He is a member of the Police Advisory Group of Badge of Life Canada, an organization dedicated to furthering PTSD awareness and advocacy. Before pursuing policing as a career, Brian went to law school and trained as a lawyer, but never practiced. In 2010, Brian finally decided to make his call to the bar, and now his lawyer's robes, even though they've been worn only once, hang in his office next to his body armor. Brian's wife, Kathy, a cop's daughter, is a teacher and trauma counselor for families and spouses of first responders. She co-wrote a chapter of Brian's book and is one of the strongest women he knows. They have 2 teenage sons who still think it's cool to have a dad who is a cop. All right, let's jump right into the interview with Brian. Brian, welcome to the Veteran Resource Podcast. How you doing today?
Excellent. Thanks for having me on, Jeremy. It took a couple of times to get here, but I really appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Well, good things come to those who wait, right?
Well, let's hope.
Okay, so Brian, let's start out with just a little bit about your background.
Okay. Well, I'm unlike a lot of your guests. I don't have an affiliation with the military, and I'm not retired. I'm not active service. My background is actually the first response world. So I'm in my 18th year of policing. And during that time, I've been lucky enough to serve in multiple areas. Currently, I'm an operations manager at a mid-sized detachment. We call it up here. I guess in the U.S. you'd call it it would be the equivalent to the state police where I work.
Gotcha.
But there's about 40 officers where I work. We mostly patrol the highway, so it'd be very similar, like I said, to a state police barracks. But I've been really lucky. In my time, I've done traffic, investigations, recruiting. I did a little stint in dignitary protection, some background investigations. So I've kind of been all over the place. So when you work for a big organization, that's definitely one benefit.
Right.
And my wife comes from a policing family. Her dad was a police officer. Her sister is. I have one son who's considering policing, so it kind of runs in the blood.
Very nice.
And also, I also have a background in law. I was before I became a police officer, I was actually a criminal lawyer. And I keep my ticket up, so I can't practice, but it's nice to have that paper hanging on the wall that says people can pay me if they want for the privilege of defending them. So
Now that's a little bit unusual. Don't people normally go the other way? Like they start in law enforcement and work their way, uh, put themselves through school and sometimes become a lawyer? And
Yeah,
you started out as a lawyer?
that's the more common. I kind of did it all ass backwards. Um, I actually finished law school and decided that I was done schooling. I didn't want to go on anymore, and I started looking at policing as a career. And spent a couple of years on the road, and then went, you know what? I'm tired of saying what if. Went back, finished all my certifications, and did my call to the bar uh, in 2010. Whereas, like you said, most people, they're police officers first. They get intrigued by the court system or by the justice system, and they go the other way. So I did it all backwards. I think there's only about 6 or 7 of us who are lawyers in an organization I work for of about 8,000 people. So I'm a
Wow.
little unique that, yeah.
Wow.
But I often joke if the laws up here were a little different, I could arrest somebody and then immediately start to offer them advice and draw from their bank account for them. So yeah, it's kind of an unusual combination, but I'm super happy I went to law school, and I think it gives me a really different perspective on policing from a lot of my peers.
Yeah, I bet it does. I bet you that helps you to be more of a go-to person for your peers.
Yeah, that, and I get tapped a lot for, hey, I have a question about a house I'm buying, or hey, I have a question about my separation agreement. So um, that might be my career when I finally retire, is to cater just to police officers in their personal situations. There seems to be enough work, unfortunately, to keep a lawyer busy doing that.
Right.
As I'm sure you can imagine, or as I'm sure you've heard, first response can be very tough on the home life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when it comes to being a lawyer, the really good ones really know how to niche down, and niching down to only first responders, that would be a great niche for you.
Well, I haven't totally given it up yet. There's days my wife urges me more than others to consider it, but for the for the time being, I'm still very happy in uniform, and I love doing what I do.
Excellent. So in the beginning, you kind of mentioned that you don't have a background in the military, uh, but what you do have is you've got some experience with PTSD, which a lot of the listeners will definitely be able to relate to, and that's why I wanted to bring you on. Um, can you tell us, what does PTSD look like to you?
Sure. So a little back, and actually, I love the question because when I speak to first responder groups, or when I do speaking, I always say, trauma is very relative. So I think that's a fantastic question to ask, different people, how do they see trauma, or what does it look like for them?
Right.
For me, it all started, it was 2004. It was a very cold, rainy October night. I was the first one on the scene of a very serious collision between a minivan and a pickup. And the driver of the minivan, I was the first one to get to him and start rendering any kind of aid. It took me probably a minute and a half, maybe, to realize that this gentleman I was, working on and trying to stop his bleeding and trying to get him his first aid under control was a very good friend of mine from university.
Oh, wow.
Uh, yeah, he had been very severely injured, and his van had rolled over a couple of times. Really severely injured, so much so that, like I said, I didn't even recognize him at first. And then, as I was just getting ready to start CPR, he died. He passed away basically as I was more or less holding him in my arms, trying to get a grip on him and stop some bleeding. And then the paramedics took over. They whisked him away. He lived a couple of days, but never regained consciousness. And I stuck around the scene for the rest of the night. I was a newly acting supervisor, so not only did I have this sort of kind of emotional and psychological blow to deal with, but I was also expected to kind of run the show the rest of the night. And that included explaining to my buddy's wife what had happened and sort of recounting the story there. And
wow.
then I never processed it properly. I never had a debriefing. I never dealt with it. I sort of pushed it away to the back of my mind, went to my buddy's funeral, helped his widow out as much as I could with, the follow-up and the paperwork, and had a couple of weeks, I guess is more fair, of, recurring thoughts and some bad dreams where I woke up with the sweats and the heart pounding and the whole 9 yards. And then it kind of faded away. And I thought, okay, I wrote it out. It's part of being a police officer, especially in a small town. And that's that's kind of a nightmare scenario for a police officer is attending a scene and the person you're dealing with is someone you know. It's only happened to me a couple of times, luckily. But of course, this time being the most serious.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, I never dealt with it. Now it'll be handled so differently now. As soon as I told somebody that night at the scene, and I got a very typical old school cop response, which was basically, hey, you know what? Life sucks. That's part of the job. You better toughen up if you're going to do this. And I thought, okay, I'm a fairly young officer. This old war horse knows better. So I took his advice to heart. Now that would be handled so differently. I would have been pulled from the scene. I would have been in front of a peer debriefer within probably an hour. I would have been relieved of duty till I'd worked some things out. We've come a long way in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so life went on. I got promoted a couple of times. We moved around for my employment. We moved around the province of Ontario a couple of times. Meanwhile, the whole 8 years or so until this would all come crashing down, it was impacting me really deeply in ways I never knew until I started to do some reflection. I was cutting myself off from my family. I was using alcohol to cope, and towards the end, just before I had a pretty bad crash, I was more or less a highly functioning alcoholic, using alcohol as a crutch to get through the days and the nights. Very strained relationship with my wife and my family, like my extended family as well. Not only my two boys, I have two sons who are teenagers now. At the time, they would have been, just little guys. I was looking for comfort in work because there was a pattern and I was in control. So I was very seldom home. It still had the occasional, nightmare thoughts, began having panic attacks. So all your sort of, I hate to say classic, but all your sort of typical scenarios of PTS, I had them all, including thoughts of suicide. One night, I didn't see any way out. It just seemed so black and so bleak. I found myself getting ready to drive my Jeep into we lived in a fairly not remote area, but a fairly rural area. And there was lots of deep ditches, lots of, roads blown through rocks. And I thought, I'm just going to drive into a rock wall and have it done with.
Wow.
And and really about the only thing that kept me from doing it was the thought of somebody I work with having to go to my home and tell my wife and kids that, I wasn't coming home. And then eventually, of course, it getting out that it was a suicide. And then having them wonder for the rest of their lives, did we miss something? Is there something we could have done or we could have seen? And that's about all that stopped me. But that was a real low point. I just didn't see any way out of what seemed to me just to be a black hole.
Wow. And so what kind of started to, I mean, that sounds like that is the bottom of the barrel. What started the upward climb to recovery for you?
Well, that's a much more pleasant part of the story. It was about 2012, actually be 5 years ago, right about now. We had just moved again for my job, for a promotion, and some greater responsibility, because like I said, I sought comfort in that, right? I wanted the next rank, I wanted the next challenge, the next job, because it was something to focus on, right? Instead of
Right.
focusing on, home and my growing kids, I was focused on me, and, really, really turned inward. So one night, my wife and I were having a very serious discussion, probably the most serious we'd ever had, about the state of our marriage, and my behavior, how I was acting as a husband and as a dad. And as we're having this discussion, there's just all these images flowing through my mind. My friend's collision, and then other scenes that I'd been to, suicides and deaths of kids and plane crashes, and it just seemed to it was rolling through my head like a film strip. And then finally I hit a point where I opened my mouth to try, and because my wife, even during this, it wasn't a heated argument, it was just serious. She clearly saw something was wrong and said, like, what's going on in there? Like, what are you thinking? And I tried a couple times to answer her. I couldn't talk, and I just finally broke down and crashed, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And it was the first time I ever said to anyone, something's wrong. I need some help. And she said, okay, well, we can fix this. And then we proceeded to have a very long talk where she heard the whole story for the first time from start to finish. And that night, she said something that pretty much saved my life. And that was, okay, Brian, I love you. I want you in our lives as husband and dad. But you need to get help or you get out. And that was, Jeremy, that was my wake up call that, okay, this is, like you said, that was pretty much the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
All I could do from there was look up.
Well, I heard on another podcast, the Eagle Nation podcast, I heard Blaine, I believe it was, and somebody else talking before about this. And one of the things that I remember them saying was, that worst point in your life, where you're totally at the bottom, like that is the worst and the best place for you to be, because
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, you can start climbing from there.
Yeah, you know what? I couldn't put it better, because yes, that was the low point, but it was also, like you said, like you alluded to, was also the first sort of glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Um, Within a couple of days, I was seeing a psychologist who actually was a military psychologist. She worked for the Canadian Forces on a base near where we lived. So her day job was working with Canadian Forces personnel coming back from deployment overseas, and helping them come down from the combat high, helping them come down from the elevated stress all the time, being under fire, constantly being wary and being ready, to a level where they could come back and hopefully pick their lives up again, resume their life with their family, resume a job. So that was her role. And of course, she dealt with lots of PTS, lots of other psychological injuries coming from this deployment, for the last 10 years to the Middle East. And then at night, she saw first responders and found that a lot of the similarity, or there were a lot of similarities, right?
Right.
It's a regimented lifestyle. There's a discipline aspect to it. Policing is paramilitary, and a lot of the experiences are shared, right? So she found it very easy to move between the two worlds. And she was fantastic. She pretty much saved my life, saved my marriage, saved my job, got me to do a lot of reflecting, a lot of thinking. The reflection wasn't always pretty. Sometimes there was some very ugly truths about myself I had to face. But she also made it clear that, what, some of these things are really tough to look at in the mirror. But when you come through them, it's another hurdle you've gotten over, and it's another step closer to getting back to, the dad, the cop, the husband, the son that you were.
Right.
so I said that was 5 years ago, and now, in that time I've come, I couldn't be further from that guy I was 5 years ago. Um, so those couple of words, finally admitting, you know what, I need help. It was like a weight coming off my shoulders, and it was the wake up call I needed to start to want to come back to the real world.
Right, right. And so all of this experience that you had, the lows, the highs, the down, the up, this all led to on the other side of broken. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. And actually, it's almost directly. Well, it is directly related, I would say. Um, my doctor was very supportive in that I wanted to do as much natural or holistic healing as I could. Right. I understood the concept of medication. It was great. When you needed it to get back to level, fantastic. But I made it really clear to her that I would like to do as much as I could, naturally. So exercise, yoga, nutrition, diet, massage, just self-care, taking care of yourself. And one of the things that she had me do was write. And she said, start carrying a notebook around with you, or a scratch pad, or, whatever. And when you have an idea during the day, or a thought that strikes you as, funny or sad or odd, or a question you'd like to bounce off me next session, write it down. So I started doing that. I'd always enjoyed writing, and I thought, okay, this is a natural outlet. And, a notebook became two notebooks, became three or four, plus all kinds of notes scribbled on, scratch pads and sticky notes, and even things like, the back of cereal boxes and pizza boxes. And so we moved again in 2014. And when we were unpacking, my wife, Kathy, pulled this sort of stack of writing out and said, listen, she started going through it and said, there's some really good stuff in here. That stuff, if you knew when you were a rookie cop, or if you were a rookie supervisor, would have made a huge difference. You've always talked about writing a book, let's do it. So I thought, okay, if for nothing else, let's get some, we'll do it as some catharsis and some closure. And I set a challenge for myself to write my story out by New Year's Eve of 2015. And I made it by about 6 hours.
Really? Wow, that is awesome. And that's one of the things I had AJ Fuller on, AC Fuller, I'm sorry, not too long ago, who is a book writer, and he talks about, having those deadlines in there. That definitely helps. So putting that deadline in there and then nailing it within hours.
Oh yeah, if I hadn't sort of set myself a hard deadline,
Mm-hmm.
it would have just been, I'll work on it here and there. But yeah, I wrapped up about 6 o'clock on New Year's Eve, and had a beer to celebrate.
Nice.
And then, yep. And I should say as well, as part of the treatment, there was also some concurrent work with the alcohol, because I'd made alcohol such a tool for so many years. My doctor was very, pretty much blunt, saying, listen, you can't treat one without the other. So there was also some aspects of recovery and, coming back from the addiction, basically the alcoholism. And now it's something it's definitely under control. And now I have the occasional drink socially. But I don't ever want to get back to that point where I was, where it was a crutch and it was a tool to get through the day, because I'm sure many of your listeners will recognize that in themselves, and that's a horrible place to be. So, and concurrent treatment of addictions and PTS is actually becoming more and more common for that exact reason. You can't treat one without the other.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry about that aside there. So then I sat on this Word document, for 2 or 3 months, until a friend of mine who did self-publishing said, "Hey, listen, I can walk you through it." And literally, like on a Wednesday afternoon, I went from having a Word document to Thursday afternoon, being ready to hit print and have this book published.
Wow.
And it was so funny because he said, "Okay, it's ready to go. Let's print it." And I'm like, "Whoa, wait a minute. I haven't even really talked to my family about this. If I'm going to tell this, I mean, because I really pulled no punches in the book, because I promised myself when I wrote it, I was going to tell good, bad, and ugly about trauma and about resiliency and about this addictions aspect. So there was a lot of unflattering stuff in there. A lot of writing about issues with our marriage and issues with myself as a father. So I actually went home and sat down with my family and said, "Look, this can happen. Is everybody cool with it? Because I'm not going to do it unless everyone's in agreement." And my sons were very supportive, especially when they heard they were in it. So they were all over that. And then one of my sons was very much like, "Hey, cool. I'm in a book. Great. Let's go for it." My older son, a little more studious, a little more serious. So he took time to, he wanted to read it. He wanted to do a little more research about PTSD and came back to me very seriously and said, "Dad, if this will help some other kid get their dad back, then, go for it." Which left my wife, and again, like I said, I there's some very unflattering things about our marriage and about our relationship. And she was very much like my son. She said, "Listen, if putting this out there can help another family, miss the 4 or 5 years of hell that we went through getting you back, then let's do it." And then the next day, literally, it was click print, and 5 days later, I had a book in my hands.
Wow. And as far as supporting you with this, your wife not only supported you with it, but she actually has a chapter in the book. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. When I finished the first draft, and actually so like I mentioned that discussion we had, she pretty much literally sat down that night and wrote out her chapter. Because when she read through it, she said, "You know what? There's not a lot out there for spouses. Can I add something to it?" Absolutely. So she did a chapter on, some suggestions for spouses, some suggestions for self-care, sort of, self-care for the caretaker. Because if
Yeah.
you're giving all the time, eventually that starts to burn you out, right? I mean, and there were days when, she basically kept me alive. She was feeding me protein shakes and supplements and making appointments for me, almost literally helping me get dressed in the morning, pick out a uniform for the day. So I really put her through the ringer. Like like I said, when I talk about this, I'm always completely upfront, and I really did put her through the ringer. And there were many times she would have been justified in packing my bags and going, "You know what? I'm done with you. Get the hell out. Get out of, go and sort yourself out somewhere else." So
Yeah.
the fact she stuck through it, I think, really shows her character. And not only that, but she took what she took. She's a teacher by trade, so she was a teacher for about a dozen years before we moved. One of the times we moved, and she actually took a leave when this all happened to sort out, me and the family, and just kind of step back and sort of refocus on getting us, better as a group. And during that time, she realized that, she could put her education and this experience to use. So she actually is now certified as a family counselor, and she works more or less exclusively with the families and spouses of first responders, working them through, issues around, not only PTSD, but also issues around, how it disrupts the life and the weird schedule, and worrying about your spouse when he or she is at the office. So she really took this and made what was at times a very negative experience into a real positive one.
That's
So we
great.
yeah, so we both actually, as a family, we've been able to really come a long way from 5 years ago. And there's actually a term called post-traumatic growth that's exact sorry, post-traumatic growth, which is that exact definition, that if you can come through a post-traumatic or a psychological incident or a critical incident, you can not only get back to the person that you were, but you can come back, better, a better husband, with closer, more intimate relationship, a better dad, tighter with your kids, better at work because, you now have empathy for, the people you're dealing with. So in my case, say when I'm dealing with people dealing with mental illness, I have way more understanding, way more empathy than I did, when I was a rookie. Um, I think it's a great concept, and not every professional in the mental health field believes it. But I do, because I feel that I lived it. So it's nice to think that, yeah, for 10 years or so there, it was rough. It was hell. But you come out of it, having this experience and now being able to start speaking and writing and, doing things like being on You with a podcast. Like I said, 5 years ago, I was a shell. And if you'd asked me to get on a podcast and talk, I would have, told you were out of your mind. So,
Right, right. You've come a long way for sure, and now you're able to help so many more people just with your story and being able to put out there, your journey and what you went through, and they can relate to it, and then show here's what worked for you. What works for other people might not be exactly the same, but this is what worked for you, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, like I said, trauma is very relative. There are certainly some common, characteristics to it and some common threads. But I think one of the biggest things, and I mentioned speaking. So I speak to and do training on operational stress injuries, post traumatic stress, resilience for both first responders, and I've spoken to a couple military groups and civilians who are in fields like child protection or the medical field, where they're not really on the front line per se, but they're dealing with traumatic incidents, they're dealing with people in crisis, and eventually, it adds up.
Yeah.
And one of the common threads I hear over and over is people just hear that. I'm sorry, people just want to hear that they're not alone. They're not going through the experience by themselves. There are other people out there who've gone through it, who've been through it, who've beaten it, and that there's no shame in this as an injury. For a long time there was a stigma around PTSD and psychological injuries. Right?
Right.
You couldn't hack it, or you were broken, or you shouldn't be in uniform, or you shouldn't be in the military, or you should have been a firefighter, whatever the case may be. And it scares me, and it saddens me to think how many good men and women never recovered from that, and never took the steps to get themselves better, and in a lot of cases have taken their lives because they couldn't admit they were having problems. And because of that stigma, it led them to, get out the only way they could. And I'm very happy to say that stigma seems to be fading, and PTS seems to be an issue that's more and more in the media, and more top of mind, and more understood and accepted.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right. The more people learn how common this is, the more people are going to feel as though they're not the only one out there. They can actually turn to somebody else. And speaking of that, I was looking at your website, and I saw some of the stats on there. When you were prepping for the book, you interviewed 200 first responders. Is that correct?
Yeah, thereabouts. It was actually 200 211 or something
Oh,
like
wow.
that. But
Okay.
yeah, around 200. Yep.
And the stats there, 80 or approximately 80% of them experience PTSD effects. Is that correct?
Yeah, that runs with professional studies and with actual studies done by researchers that show about anywhere from I shouldn't say anywhere from that in the neighborhood of 75% across the board of first responders, and that could be police, fire, EMS, corrections officers, military, have PTS to one, to one extent or another. So just about three quarters, and in some cases, of course, it's very mild, and it might only take the form of the occasional intrusive thought. And in some cases, and unfortunately, I've seen some of these. It's completely debilitating, and it cuts the person's career short, and it completely impacts their life and the way that they have to live.
Wow. Wow. Well, yeah, that's really shows just how many there are out there. So if you're listening to this and you have some PTSD symptoms, you are definitely not alone.
No, absolutely. And again, hearing that and actually to give you an idea of how things have changed and sort of how prevalent it is. In 2012, the government of Ontario, the province I live in Canada, released a report on how police services dealt with officers with psychological injuries, and it was not very flattering. And for the most part, the results were that police services were failing their officers, were not offering enough support, enough services, and it was really holding back, the potential for healing and for getting back on the job that these officers had. And at the time, I was in a command role, and we were asked as commanders to share this with our officers and to talk about it and to get a dialogue going. And at the time, I was in charge of about 150 officers and civilian personnel. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to do better than that, than just share a web link. I'm going to tell my story. So for the first time ever to a peer group, I sat down and typed out my tale. And I remember just before hitting send, thinking, okay, once you do this, there's no going back, right? You're about to tell the world that you've dealt with this. And it might change some people's impressions of you. It might potentially harm your career prospects down the road. And then I thought, no, you know what? To hell with it. It's way more important to get the message out. And I hit send. And then I kind of sat back and went, oh my God, what did I just do?
The toothpaste is out already. You can't put it back in.
Yep. It took 2 minutes until I had a response from one of my officers saying, thank you for writing this. I've been living with this for 10 years. Thank you for getting it. And then they just started to roll in one after another. Thank you. I can't believe someone else gets this.
Wow.
By that night, I was getting emails from police officers in other parts of my province I'd never met saying, hey, a buddy of mine sent me this, and it's so awesome you're able to say this. And, I thought I was the only one dealing with it. So, over the course of the next, say, 3 or 4 days, I probably got 500 emails from,
wow.
And then it spread to firefighters and paramedics and corrections, and that's when I also thought, you know what, this is a huge area. There's clearly a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for support out there. Why not start talking about it? Why not come from a place of lived experience? So I started my speaking engagements about it shortly after that. And I'm very happy to say every time that I go in front of a group and talk, or my wife and I also do a presentation where we focus a lot on the spouses as well. Without fail, I always get at least one person come up to me and say, I thought I was the only person who ever dealt with this. Thanks. I'm going to call my doctor tomorrow, or I need to go home and talk to my wife about this because she'll agree. Or couples come up, or spouses will go up to my wife and say the same thing. You know what? Now I understand why my wife is so miserable when she comes home, or why my husband is has pulled away from the family. So to be able to have that kind of impact on someone, and in some cases be able to play a role in them making an admission, or making a discovery that's going to change their lives. It's as somebody who started policing because I wanted to help people, it's very, very humbling. And I've had some amazing experiences because of the book, and because of being so open about my experiences. People from literally all over the world,
Wow.
emailing or sending messages. And some people I never would have expected. I think the one that sticks with me the most is, because my contact info is in the book. So I got an email from a gentleman who lives in the UK, and I think he said for about 20 years he'd been in the military, and not just the military. He was in the SAS, which is the Special Air Service, which is one of their elite combat units.
Hmm.
And this guy had served in every piece of crap hellhole theater of war in the world. He'd been in Bosnia. He'd been in both Gulf Wars. He was in the Falklands. I mean, this guy, and he was a sniper, so which is a whole different world, in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
And this, I mean, he was decorated, and he was a sniper instructor. I mean, this guy was a badass. He was a legitimate badass. And he wrote me this message saying that, he read the book in one go. He ordered it for his Kindle or his Kobo or whatever, read it in one go, ordered a paper copy to give to his wife. And that was going to be his way of telling his wife, I'm sorry. Here's what's been wrong with me for the last 15 years. Let's fix this. And I thought, my God, like this is a guy who has been through literally the wars. And to think that something I wrote impacted him that much, like I said, it's very humbling. So I've had some experiences in that sense that I never thought I'd have, and that have made it all worthwhile to tell my story.
Wow. When you think of it that way, going through what you went through was a gift that you were given in order to be able to help so many other people all over the world.
Absolutely. It took me a long time to get to that point where I would agree with you. For a long time, I was bitter because I felt like my agency let me down when really they didn't. There was things I could have asked for and things I could have requested, that I didn't. I was mad at the other driver. I was mad at my friend. I was mad at my wife, my kids, for not seeing something was wrong and not getting it. And it took a lot to work through that. And
Yeah.
then, for a long time I thought, oh, why me? Why did I have this horrible luck where I was the first one there and it was a friend? And then I had somebody put a whole different perspective on it for me. 3 years ago, I went on a week-long retreat, and I try and do at least one sort of growth event a year for myself as part of my sort of ongoing self-care. And I went on a retreat, and we were talking one night, and I told my story. Back then, I wasn't really. It was very tough to tell it and get through it without having to stop or having to, kind of break down a little bit. And one of the girls who was on this retreat with me said, well, did you ever think that maybe it was meant to be you? And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? Why would it be me? And why would somebody curse me with that? And she said, well, your friend didn't die alone. He died with someone he knew. He didn't die with just some random police officer, some random paramedic. He died next to somebody he had shared lots of good times with, and your voice was the last thing he heard. And I thought, oh my God,
Wow.
not once in the 10 years did I ever look at it that way. And once I sort of opened my eyes a bit and kind of broadened my horizons a little bit with experiences and sort of let some shields down, I started to have all these realizations that, like you said, in a way, this really was a gift. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, the actual experience and the actual aftermath, but the potential and the possibilities it's brought to me for growth and for change are just phenomenal, and that I can never deny.
Yeah. Something I used to say a long time ago, used to say this quite often, is that, things happen for a reason, but, it's pretty egotistical to think that that reason is always something to do with you. what,
Yeah,
what happened
that's
here, you're looking at it the whole time as if, this happened specifically to you and not for him.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Until that night, sitting around that fire with a over coffees, and that that girl making that comment to me, you're right. I never thought of it that way. And to think of it as to think of the whole thing now as basically kind of an act of service makes it a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah.
And that's what I try. And that's what I try and leave groups with when I, at the end of my talk is that, look, it can be a horrible experience. It will always be with you, but it's also, life is what you make of it. For a long time, I let it rule my emotions and rule how I lived my life and lived a life of blame and of bitterness. Once I started to look at it as, like you said, an opportunity to be with someone at the end of their life, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to rebuild ties with my family, it changed my whole perspective on it.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say that's why when my wife and I started to do this and start speaking, we basically promised ourselves, much like with the book, we were going to be completely honest, completely open, because there's no sense really in holding back, right? Because we want people to see, like I said, the good, bad, and the ugly. And we want
Right.
to leave, whether it's the person dealing with the trauma or the person supporting them, we want to leave them with, look, there, you know what, it can get better. You'll hit that low point that you mentioned, but eventually you do start looking up the hill. And if you can stick it out, and if you can stick it out, hopefully together as a family or as a couple, then it makes getting through it all that much sweeter at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and bring up Project Healthy Heroes. Now, I saw this on the website and I was curious how this all fits into it.
Well, so Project Healthy Heroes is, and actually we've just changed the name to match the book. So it's actually, the whole concept now is called, it's actually called On the Other Side of Broken, but it's the same concept. So it matches the book title.
Okay.
Project Healthy Heroes grew from, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the healing I did was natural, was because, instead of using junk food and alcohol to cope, I started using exercise and, proper nutrition and proper sleep, to cope. And I really firmly believe, and my doctor agrees, that having sort of a mixed approach to healing and to therapy made a huge difference. So on the one side with her was, sort of traditional talk therapy, right? The old classic, lay on the psychiatrist's couch and tell your life story.
Right.
And then, like I said, she was very open to working in other things. So that's when she recommended the writing and the exercise. And there's actually, my wife found actually a fantastic program, a nutritional program that had everything all in one. And it could have almost been geared towards dealing with the physical effects of trauma, because, like I said, for a long time, I relied on junk food and alcohol for comfort. Right. And sometimes my sleep was alcohol induced, so my sleep wasn't solid. And this program just tackled everything, detoxed and proper nutrition, which went along with, the increased exercise I was doing to cope with stress and to vent some of the negative energy. So I had enough people ask me about it. I thought, you know what, clearly there's an interest in officers not only healing from trauma or other critical incidents this way, but building up resiliency. So that's what that program is about working with officers to get them healthy and get them to a point where they're resilient enough that if something does happen, they'll bounce back more quickly and the impact will be less. And if once they are into the weeds, same thing. There'll be systems and patterns in place that we can walk through them with that will help with the healing and that will support the work that a professional therapist or psychologist is doing. And then that also ties in, like I said, my wife does counseling. She hopefully with her clients implements lots of the same concepts of, letting the body heal naturally, right? Because quite frankly, healthy body usually equals healthy mind and vice versa. For me, some of the things that I picked up as supplements to what my doctor was doing with traditional therapy, started running. Not a huge running fan, but it was so therapeutic, I couldn't pass it up. Kayaking, biking. I did some equine therapy, which is working with horses, which is becoming more and more common with trauma. And I actually went on a fantastic equine therapy retreat, and I would urge anybody who is hearing this to explore it as a treatment option. I got more in that 3 or 4 days growth for myself than I ever thought I would. From a program like that. Fantastic treatment option. Clearly, and I've had enough other first responders ask about this concept of natural healing, and with Kathy working into her practice as well, that we decided, hey, let's just create this concept where people who want to live that way and people who want to start to build up the resilience and be able to bounce back more quickly, we're more than willing to help them do that. So that's part of that sort of also goes along with the speaking and the writing. We try and offer other people who are willing to come to us for help. We want to offer them as many options as we can.
Excellent. And I love adding the holistic side of it, because I really think that does play an important role, a much better role than just taking handfuls of pills. And that is what I've heard as the biggest complaint from veterans is, when trying to deal with PTSD, is they feel that they're taking too much medication. So I love the Project Healthy Hero, or the renamed on the other side of broken program that you have going on.
And you know what? I mean, the easy thing, let's face it, a lot of, and actually I have an acquaintance right now who's going through this exact issue with doctors playing with her meds, and she's up and down, and her doctor doesn't really believe in the concept, in holistic concepts, and, keeps juggling her medication. So she's up and down. And I mean, that's no way to live, you know? And I know in where you are in the US, I know that the medical system is completely different. I mean, we're very lucky in Canada to have, the concept of socialized medicine. So the basics are taken care of for you, right?
Right.
And then, you get benefits with your job as far as, meds and massage and chiropractic and all those other things. But I know quite often, and I know it hits veterans hard, they either can't afford the medication they need, or they have to make a choice between meds and paying off, other things in their life, or the doctor, just like you said, wants to shove, handfuls of pills down their throat, and that's the treatment. And there's no thought given to all those holistic things. If you look at cultures like the Chinese, they've been using holistic medicine for thousands of years, way before anybody ever decided to crush up pills or crush up, powders and make them into pills.
Right.
So I really firmly believe, like you said, that that a holistic approach, if you can find a doctor who will let you blend the two, absolutely the best approach.
Yep. Yep. And I've had people on the show that that specialize in equine therapy. I've had others that specialize in having pet therapy or athletic therapy, music therapy, art therapy. And at first, they were saying, well, I don't know, this might or might not work. But since then, studies have been, there's been research done, and studies show that these do benefit people with PTSD with their symptoms. So now it's not a guess anymore as to whether or not this works. It's been proven. We know that it works. So I love when organizations or people start to, try to get this information out even to a wider audience and inform people that these things are available to you. Sometimes medication is needed, but if you can incorporate the medication that's needed in with holistic methods, and then you can kind of try to wean yourself from the meds that are needed over time. I think that's the best approach.
And you know what? That's exactly, again, I'm so grateful to my doctor for being the way she was. That's exactly what she said is, look, the meds you need right now, so this is at the beginning of my therapy. You need medication to get back. Right now, you're low. You're way down here, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to get you back to neutral. Once you're there, let's start playing with other ideas like, like the equine stuff, like the sports therapy, like art, like writing. And good to her word, as soon as we got back to that point where she sort of felt like I was functioning at a normal level again, she said, okay, let's start working in some of the other aspects.
Nice.
And one thing I tell groups when I speak with them is, to a large extent, you're responsible for your own health. You have to be your own advocate. So not everybody will gel with every counselor or every doctor they see for the first time. And I mean, if you think about it, this is your psychological health, your physical health, in some cases, quite literally, your life you're putting in someone else's hands. If you're not comfortable with their course of treatment for you, or you are arguing over how you should be treated, it's just setting you back. So sometimes you might have to do a little bit of doctor shopping until you find somebody who does believe in holistic therapy, or who is willing to let you try and get things under control by changing your diet or whatever the case may be.
Right.
So not every therapist and every patient, fit together like puzzle pieces. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of legwork.
Great advice. And speaking of advice, before we sign off here, is there any last tidbits of knowledge you'd like to, any light you'd like to shed for the listeners that could be of help to them in dealing with symptoms?
Sure. And I guess I'll give one piece for the people who might be suffering, and I'll give one piece for the spouses.
Perfect.
So for spouses or family, and this is one of the things Kathy always says when she does her part of our talk, is there were so many times that she had the gut feeling that something wasn't right, that something was wrong, that I wasn't the same Brian she had married. I was pulling away, and she was afraid to say anything about it because she thought, well, no, what if I do say something and I'm wrong? Is he going to be mad? Is he going to be insulted? Or what if I do say something and I'm right, and then it drags up all these horrible things to deal with? Looking back now, she would tell any spouse that her biggest regret is not calling me out on it sooner. Because that would have saved a lot of heartache. It would have saved a lot of emotional pain, financial pain, psychological, back and forth. So for a little while, and again, she would tell any audience this, she was actually seeing her own counselor as well. to cope with, the offshoot of taking care of me and all these other things. And I know that can be very difficult as a spouse especially of a first responder who generally are, type A personalities, very proud. A lot of times it's, don't want to talk about it. Sometimes you might have to push a little bit, because if you know your spouse, best. If you think you're starting to lose them to something that's haunting them, or if you maybe have already lost them, open a dialogue. Do it however you have to. In some cases, again, I've been super lucky that spouses have told me they've ordered the book for their spouse and handed it to them and said, just read this. And, so again, I'm very flattered that people are using that as a tool to open a dialogue. So if you think your spouse is being impacted by something hitting them on the job, you're probably right. And quite frankly, if Kathy had approached me and said, hey, can we talk? Something doesn't seem right. And beyond the just, oh yeah, I'm fine, beyond that level of conversation, had probed a little bit, I would have been so grateful. So that's what I would leave for the spouses or families is, if your gut says something, you're probably right, and go with it. And for the uniforms who are listening, the piece of advice I would say is it's very similar. If you think something's wrong and you know that you're not yourself, and something is haunting you, something won't leave your mind, something won't leave your nightmares, something occupies all your thoughts, go with your gut. You became a first responder because you trusted yourself and you worked hard and you made sacrifices to get there. You know yourself, and take that step to tell someone. Take that step to admit it to yourself, and then let somebody in. And I know that can be so difficult, because like I said, type A personalities don't want to burden our families. We're the caretakers, right? Our job is to take care of other people, not the other way around.
Right.
We're not the ones who need the help. That mentality and that stigma, Jeremy, is killing us. It's killing military. It's killing first responders who feel like they have no other way out. And they take that step that I contemplated that night, and they do take their lives. They do drive off that bridge. They do reach for that firearm. Life is too short to spend it being haunted by something you did because you decided to join a profession that's noble and honorable. And it doesn't mean that you're broken. I hate it. I use that term very deliberately in the book, right? Because that was used about me once. That was used in reference to me once. And admitting that, seeking out help, it's just like a physical injury. If you blew out your knee while you were lifting a patient, or if you screwed up your back while you were fighting with a prisoner, you wouldn't hesitate to go get chiro and massage and see a doctor, go to the ER. This is no different. The stigma will start to go away when brothers and sisters in uniform are willing to stand up and say, yeah, something's wrong. It happened to me because of this job. Let's fix it.
Right.
So it's not really in a nutshell, but that's what I would leave everybody with. Swallow your pride and either confront your spouse or your family member, and swallow your pride and confront yourself.
I love it. Thank you so much. And Brian, how can people get to your book, or even if they're looking to bring you on as a speaker, how can people connect with you?
Okay, well, the website is knowlerconsulting.com, and that's KNOWLER consulting.com. Both of our email addresses are on there. The Facebook group is called On the Other Side of Broken. So if you do a Facebook search for that, you can find that. The book is actually, I still find it so cool to say this, that the book is on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble, Indigo in Canada. It's also an iBook, so it can be found through the iBook store. The best platform, and usually the quickest one, is directly through the publisher. and the publisher is lulu.com, Lulu.com. Just do a search for my name in the search box. It takes you right to the page where you can buy either an e-copy or a hard copy. And if all else fails, my email is just Brian, Brian, at knowlerconsulting.com. And that's I monitor that all the time. If there's anybody who would like me to, have some questions or would like me to expand a little bit more, or anybody who just wants to get something off their chest with somebody who, feels like they get it, I get emails like that all the time, and I'm more than happy to talk to anybody out there and give them a point in the right direction.
Outstanding. And I will make sure that I put the links to all of these things in the show notes page to make it super easy for listeners to click on and get connected with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I feel like there's been so much great information that you shared with us today. And I'm very thankful that you were able to make it on the show.
It's my pleasure. And like I said, more than happy to talk to your listeners after offline. This is a great thing you're doing. And I'm very, very flattered that you felt enough of me as a resource to get me on. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Well, you have a great day, Brian.
Thank you. Take care, my friend.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Veteran Resource Podcast. As always, make sure you go and check out the show notes. You can get there by going to veteranresourcepodcast.com/091, and you will get more information about Brian and find out about his book and consulting, and you'll find all of the links that you need to get over and get connected with him. I really hope that there's some people out there who got a lot from this episode. I love the advice that Brian gave at the end for both people that might be having some symptoms of PTSD and for spouses. I think that was great. Go back and listen to that again if you need to. And also remember, if you're suffering from PTSD, you are not alone. There's other people out there. Just take that first step to getting back to good and let somebody know. That's all I have for you today. I will see you next week for episode 92.